Although it was already over 5 years ago, I still remember vividly to this day that very first announcement that school was coming to a close at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, being a mere 11 years old, I didn't understand the true scale of the matter beyond simply the fact that I was getting what I saw to be a longer summer break. But as time kept on passing and we went from March to April, the challenges of the pandemic began to present themselves to me in a very realistic manner. Now, at the April peak, US unemployment reached 14.9%, and the global economy shrunk 3.5%. Now, what does this mean? It means that there is less room for spending on non-necessities like TVs, pool tables, and entertainment. And for most, this little advantage in saving a bit of cash seemed to be very minor. But for my parents, who are both in the performing arts industry, this presented an exemplary challenge. From social distancing regulations to spending, the challenges seemed to stack themselves on top of one another. And my parents wanted to be optimistic during that time and remain assured that everything would return to normal. But with each canceled concert, I slowly watched the color drain from that optimism as they sat around the dining room table, trying to figure out how else to sustain our living. At that very point, I saw my family almost like a ship anchor in choppy waters, but one that would keep having to get redeployed because it couldn't stabilize its vessel. Before long, it was June, and isolation no longer felt like a cushy summer break. The strain was heavy, and it made life difficult for me, my family, and billions of others who knew deep in our hearts that we were meant to be elsewhere. In other words, the world could not remain at a standstill. For my parents, things only got worse, with each passing day showing no foresight into their job stability, and they knew that if they didn't act soon, they would lose most of the livelihood that they had worked so hard to get. And the stress, like a cloud, covered their conscience and tied them down and forced them to work with the resources that they had left. And for my 11-year-old self, this introduced a particular emotional burden that I didn't know how to resolve, and I felt helpless. But in my parents' search for more opportunities to sustain our livelihood, my mom came across an opportunity in late June, which forever changed my life, and it was a 3-month online investment course. Over the next several weeks, she sat down, she studied, and myself, being fascinated with what she was doing, decided to follow suit. Now, at that point, I had no control over where the pandemic was going, but I knew that I would use every single card that I had been dealt. Today, thinking back to that point, I remember constantly thinking about my parents, my sister, my family, and I put this pursuit of knowledge upon myself as being my primary responsibility. I knew that I wanted to have control over my own life. I wanted to be able to protect my family in times of crisis. And most importantly, I understood the necessity of having a personal financial anchor. So, without hesitation, I took my piggy bank containing $600 of pure birthday cash that I had stacked up from over the years, smashed it on the floor, picked up the money, and I still laugh at the fact that I genuinely did this at the age of 11. I took all the money in my hands, I walked up to my parents, I said, I want to invest this. So rather than buying a Lego that's 2 times my height or a remote control airplane, I handed it to them and I ended up buying shares in Google. And that is exactly why this piece of paper holds so much significance in my life, beyond a simple means of exchange or measure of material wealth. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world that for many decades prior has been guided by the bounds of Keynesian demand-driven economics and neoclassical economic theory. That is a lot of buzzwords in one sentence, so I'll break it down into a little bit of a more understandable context. So, Keynesian demand-driven economics essentially states that economic growth is driven by constant consumer demand for goods and services. So, we pay up hard-earned money for those goods and services that we can derive benefit and value from, and the companies and businesses that we buy those goods and services from can get profit, which they can then use to reinvest. And that continues in a cycle, and that's how capital or money moves throughout our economy. And the way neoclassical economic theory really plays into this is it describes us consumers as rational agents. And it sort of hones in on those exchanges that define an economy in saying that, right, we as rational agents have our own intentions with an exchange, and the businesses we buy goods and services from have their own intentions. For us, we want to derive what consumers call utility, or what economists call utility. So it's essentially meaning what benefits can we derive from the goods and services that we buy. And for the businesses, it's how can we make a profit on what we sell. So I want to ask you, and if anyone feels comfortable to raise their hand and tell, has anyone bought a Nike product recently? It's just show of hands. Shoes, socks, a hat. Okay. Does anyone mind sharing where they bought it from, where they bought the product from?
Bergen Town Center.
Okay. Nike outlet. Okay. So that is a Nike store. So that is essentially a relationship where you have Nike producing its goods overseas and then selling them directly to consumers. And also you'll notice Nike recently created their website, which introduces a direct-to-consumer distribution path, meaning they sell directly from them, they make the shoe and they sell to the consumer. And as the consumer, you pay a premium for the shoes that you buy, right? And as part of that premium, right, the company that's selling them, which in this case is Nike, charges that premium because they need to make a profit relative to what they're manufacturing the shoe for. And so in this case, right, we as buyers, we can get benefit because we have something to cover our feet. We have something comfortable. We have a sporty good now. So we get benefit for ourselves. And the companies that were selling the shoes to us, so Nike in this case, that was selling the shoe to us, can use the profit that it took to maybe invest in new factories, increase wages. So there's this constant relationship that really is just one case study of millions in which the exchanges of money for goods and services really dictates how our economy flows. So going back to this idea of us as being consumers, I don't doubt that all of you understand the importance of this piece of paper right here, but I don't think all of you really think of it as the administrative body over everyday lives. And so what I mean by this is that money is incredibly misunderstood in a number of ways. And if we don't take the time to understand this, we are better off just taking this piece of paper, throwing it behind us, and accepting what I call the money mess. Hello everyone, my name is Max Deninzon, and I am a junior at the Bergen County Academies in the Academy of Business and Finance. And I'm standing here before you all today as part of my journey to communicate the necessity of financial literacy. At the Academies, I am president of the investment club called the Investment Analysis Group, and I have recently begun work online to teach about financial markets and introduce a personal financial foundation for all individuals of all ages who are looking to hopefully gain some sort of background. So as part of my journey in both learning and communicating ideas, social media has been an extremely important platform. And as a frequent user of social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram, just for a show of hands, how many of you have seen those get-rich-quick influencers, right? Okay, so it's pretty common, right? Whether it's driving a Lamborghini Huracan or buying a waterfront Miami villa, that all is addresses a very sensitive area for us because money is a very important subject matter for all people. And the thing about it is most people will know better than to listen, right? Don't believe everything that you see online. We've all heard that at one point or another. But the problem is social media has become so advanced that the content that we're being fed has sort of a personal tie with us. It feeds you videos based off of what you watch, what you search, and as scary as it may be, that's the plain truth. And so it becomes very hard to sort of separate yourself when you have a personal connection with what you're watching. So in this case, right, it becomes very hard to distinguish and sort of step back and understand, right, what am I to believe, what am I not to believe? And many centuries prior, the Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau introduced a very interesting idea, I thought, even though it was many years prior to the introduction of modern-day social media. And that was that the natural human tendency is to compare oneself, and that can be averted through self-love. Now, my job here isn't to talk about love, but I do want to talk about how our understanding of this can come from the right intuition and the right guidance, rather than from irreparable sources. And the difficult thing, however, in the modern age is that as we continue to be forced to distinguish between what is true and what is false, and we're pushed away from talking about money more and more, we push ourselves closer to a very, very treacherous rabbit hole. Now, you may, of course, ask yourself, well, Max, we deal with money every day. It's an everyday thing that we encounter at one point or another. Why do we have to talk about it all the time? Well, the truth lies in the numbers. So I did a little digging, and back in 2024, the National Financial Educators Council conducted a study where they asked people, on average, how much do you estimate that you lose per year due to a lack of financial education? And the average came out to around $1,015 a year. Stack that over around 240 billion Americans, and you get around $243 billion lost annually due to a lack of sufficient financial education. And then I said, okay, what if we took that $1,015 per capita, which is a fancy way of saying per person, and you invested that every year into the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, okay? And that's assuming that every year you get 10.3% return on the money that you invest over the course of 30 years, you would end up with $176,000. It actually goes to show, just as Einstein said, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. I think that's a very true statement, as you can see here. But either way, right, it's incredible. And even if you were to contribute half of this on a monthly basis, you would be way above this value by the time you're set to retire. So it's truly an incredible thing to understand. And it's not all, but considering that a lot of financial problems begin to develop with students entering college, in a study fielded by Ramsey Education, it was said that over 87% of modern-day students entering college said that they were not prepared to handle personal finances, right? Which is a huge statistic. And although over 35% of Gen Z is currently choosing ways to hopefully explore personal finance and develop a foundation, that's nowhere near the majority. And this becomes worsened through income discrepancies, right, different income brackets, demographic differences, and so on and so forth. The list keeps on going. So in truth, right, nobody's going to help us. We need to learn to help ourselves. So when I continued to learn back at the very early stages of my path, developing skills and knowledge with regards to personal finance, there was a lot that was going wrong. I had no one to hold my hand, tell me what my mistakes were, explain to me what I could fix. I had no one to tell me about that. So it was hard to understand where to go. Okay? So at that point, I was lost, and I had continued to face losses, and thinking back today, I laugh at the fact that my 11-year-old self tried to understand what an inverse fair value gap was. So I ended up having to wait and figure out what was going on, and the worst part of it all was that in the wave of enthusiasm, I kept trying to jump 3 steps forward without taking that very first step. And I still wonder today, what would have happened to that $600 had I not had the same motivation? Would I even be standing here today giving this same speech? Well, it all carries back to that idea that most people never approach their piggy banks, just because they have no one to show them the right way and show them to the right entrance. And I remember vividly, in August of 2020, I was on the phone with my grandparents, who are 2 former engineers from the Soviet Union. And throughout elementary and middle school, they would often teach me mathematics and physics, and I was struggling at the time to understand the inner workings of a gyroscope, where my grandfather said to me something very profound. He said to me, understanding what you're doing will always have a more profound meaning than just doing something because you're told to do it. My mind was blown. I knew that I had been doing everything wrong this whole time. And so after that call was done, I rushed to my computer, and for what seemed like the next several hours, I just kept researching videos and books and various different resources. And what I uncovered over the course of the next several weeks, and of course it took me a long time to even begin to develop a proper foundation, what I uncovered was mind-blowing. It forever changed my life, from Wall Street legends to economists, and it changed my perception of what money is and what costs are, and really what defines our everyday lives. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to establish that financial literacy is a very necessary tool for a very necessary aspect of everyday life. Now, of course, talking about money around the dinner table may not be the most favorable, but I find that that supersedes any possible discomfort that may come from not discussing it. So before you all leave today, I urge you to understand that in this case, money is not something to be feared. You need to make that choice, and it comes down to two things. You can either face your fears, or you could overcome the money mess, and or you could face the struggles of the money mess. It comes down to those two choices. Okay? And ultimately, the future of the American economy and the global economy relies on our sense of judgment, and it is with good judgment that we can make good choices. And that is the same choice that I had to make when I held that piggy bank in my hands and was faced with the decision to try to help my family and to try to find a way through. I had no way out, and I was trying to find that right entrance. And it was about whether or not my conscience was ready to take that first step. So beyond money, financial literacy is a very useful tool. It is about taking action and making a choice that will forever impact how your future emerges. And that is what makes it so valuable. Thank you.